American federalism over time. Just because federalism means that a central and state powers share responsibilities and power in government doesn't mean that there's always necessarily an equal balance of power when it's distributed between the two. So we're going to look at what American federalism has looked like over time and look at some time periods which exemplify the difference between a strong central power and a strong state power when you have both powers working together. The first section we're going to look at is a time period between 1819 and 1969, where we had a very strong central power relative to the state powers in the United States. Now, that doesn't mean that the states didn't have any power. It just means that within federalism, there was more going for the central power in terms of powers that they got from the rest of the government that allowed them to do more things. And so as we look over time, we'll see how different things that government does can actually increase or decrease the amount of power which goes to the central government or conversely to the state governments. So the first time that I want to look at is 1819. We're back with Chief Justice John Marshall and with McCulloch versus Maryland, which was an early landmark case. In this case, John Marshall looked at the necessary and proper clause. What did that actually mean? What does necessary and proper mean? It's kind of ambiguous. What exactly does that give the government a power to do? So, of course, we had on one hand the states arguing, Maryland arguing that whatever it is must be necessary. But what Chief Justice John Marshall decided is that what necessary and proper means is only appropriate. So the government, the federal government, the central powers can regulate over Congress, can regulate things which are appropriate, not necessarily necessary. And so that gave a bump up for the central powers. Similarly, in Gibbons versus Ogden, we had the Commerce Clause discussed. What the Commerce Clause said is that Congress can regulate any kind of business. As long as it's business going on between the states, then regulation can be done by Congress. And so this gave more power to Congress vis-a-vis the state legislature. So this kind of gave a bump up also to central power versus state power. Secondly, we had the Civil War. Two important things in terms of federalism that I want you to know. The first one being that the southern states were denied the use of the doctrine of nullification. Now, what the doctrine of nullification was this idea that if we don't like the law that Congress has handed down to us in the states, we can nullify it. We can vote to say in our local state government that this law is just not going to apply to us. And during the Civil War, we had the determination that this was just not going to fly. Sorry, southern states, if you don't like the law that Congress hands down, too bad. It's still going to be in place and you still have to apply it. Similarly, this dovetailed with the military victory that the Union had. Of course, we had the Union versus the Confederacy, and the Union was declaring this national sovereignty and saying, really, we must act as one unit, while the Confederate states wanted more state power. And so with the victory of the Union, their particular philosophy of national sovereignty, a strong central power, was going to take the place of a stronger state power, and that was going to give us more of a bump up for central power versus state power as well. With the New Deal, looking at the period of President FDR's terms, as you know, very lengthy term that President Roosevelt had, there was one thing which he focused on in terms of federalism, which was this idea of anti-regulation. He went in there, and if you'll remember your history in the New Deal, he completely redefined the role of government. He said government is not just going to be a figurehead. Government is going to have a role as employer. They are going to be insurer. They are going to be a provider for the people. This is where, if you'll remember, we got, Social Security and a lot of the other entitlement programs that we look at today. And so we took that power from the states, moved it up to the central government, and said that the central government is going to be responsible for these things. And so that is this period between 1925 and 1934. And then in 1969, the Civil Rights era, where we had the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed national government protection of rights against the state's abuses. So this is where we incorporated the rights to protect against the government, not only at the national level, but at the state level as well. So we said, state actors, if you are going to abuse people, then we are going to hold you accountable as well, just as we had with the federal government. So federal government actors who couldn't do certain things without being penalized by the Constitution and being held accountable were going through a situation where they had a different set of standards than the states did. And so now we bumped this up so that the states had to follow the same rules, and that's why you have a situation where if a state police officer, a state actor, a state administrator of some sort violates the Constitution, violates your rights, they can be held accountable in the same way as the federal government. And so we lifted that immunity that they had in the state's power out of their hands and gave that power back to the central government. Now, this doesn't mean that we've been continuing with this trend this entire time. What we've been seeing from this period of 1819 to 1869 is a period of a strong ramp up in central power. Now we're going to look at a couple of other trends. The first is a period of devolution, which, as you can see from the graph, is really this period between 1969 and 2001, where we started to move back down. We started to take power from the central government and give it back to the states. So really shifting the power in this federalist system more back to the state government in certain ways. And then we see an era called Homeland Security, which we'll talk about in a minute, which propelled us back up in the other direction. So this graph is going to show us overall, between 1819 and about today, what we're looking at in terms of what this scale has looked like. And of course, this will continue to fluctuate, go up and down throughout our history and throughout the future as we look at what the different parts of government are going to do in order to shift power back and forth between the central and the state governments. So recent trends, devolution. Devolution doesn't necessarily mean de-evolving somebody. What it is, it's the transfer of power from the central government to the states. So really what we're looking at is a reverse trend of what we had just seen up till 1969. In this case, we see power going back to the states. So how did this happen? Well, a couple of different things. First thing that I want to point out is that we had all three of the branches of government, plus the states, on board with moving things back to state power. And that's why we saw this trend. It would probably look a little bit more up and down or a little bit more stable if just one of the branches was involved. But actually we had all three of the branches involved. And let's discuss how that happened. In the executive branch, for example, we had in the period starting in 1980 President Ronald Reagan. President Ronald Reagan was big into deregulation, really moving things out of the central government sphere back to the states. And so there was a strong push during his administration for that to happen. Congress, in the legislative branch, had some federal budget difficulties. And so they said, okay, well, let's move some of these things back to the states, and so the states can handle them budget-wise. And so they were pushing that direction as well. At the same time, we had Chief Justice Rehnquist, William Rehnquist, who was sitting in the Supreme Court, and he was supporting, through a lot of the decisions that were coming out of the Supreme Court, this move back to states' rights. And of course you had the states themselves who were supporting having more rights themselves. And so with all of this working in concert, you saw laws coming down, both formally through Congress and presidential approval, and informally through case law, which were going to say, let's give more power to the states. Let's take power from Congress, saying Congress can't regulate in situations, or it is within the states' power to deal with certain realms of governmental action, and that was going to give more state power to the states at this time. So what happened after that? We were actually on a good steady decline for a while. We looked like we were going to head into some pretty strong state power territory, and then during the period of 1997, we were kind of going, 1997, we were still in a devolution era. Really, we were still in this decline of devolution until we got into 2001. And so in 2001, and sorry, that header should read 2001, not 2011. But in 2001, of course, we had the bombing of the World Trade Centers. We had, which launched us into, with September 11th, the period called Homeland Security. And so with the destruction of the World Trade Centers, bombing was incorrect, I should say, terrorist attack, we had this new idea that the state's power needed to be moved back to the central government in order to give the central government immense ability to deal with this threat. We had to tighten our national defenses. We had to make sure that the central government was able to act in order to protect us in our homeland. And so then all of a sudden you saw TSA, and you saw the Department of Homeland Security spring up, and you saw a lot of other powers which would have been regulated to the states brought back into the central government sphere and regulated by Congress. And Congress saying, okay, now all of the states have to follow X, Y, and Z measures in order to protect us in Homeland Security. Since 2001, we have seen a little bit of a decline, however, definitely not as much as we saw during devolution. We are really back in a strong central power phase in our evolution of federalism. And so that's where we are right now. There has been a decrease, there has been a move since 2001 back to giving some power to the states, but we are nowhere close to where we had been, say, in the 80s and 90s in terms of a trend which was moving toward stronger state power. So as you can see, it really fluctuates. It really goes back and forth over time, and different activities that happen within the government, that happen to the country, are going to propel different actions by government actors, which are going to give us a more strong central power or strong state power. This isn't a bad thing. This is a good example of flexibility that we have in the country to adjust depending on what the needs of the country is at the time. But then, of course, you can see how certain instances can really change, like we see with September 11th here, can really change the scope of what's going on with the particular Federalist movement at the time. So what is it going to look like going on for the next 10, 20 years? We're not exactly sure. It's possible that we can see a continual decline through Homeland Security, where we get a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more secure, and we feel comfortable giving more power back to the states. However, as we've seen with one incident, things can dramatically change one way or another. And so it's important to keep an eye on what's going on with federalism, and to understand that it's not just this box where we are sharing 50-50 states' power and central power, but that it changes over time depending on what the country needs and what the people of the country decide that they want in terms of how their government is situated between the two powers that are cooperating.